Life in a tiny town in the Nevada desert left teenager Kirstin Lobato feeling isolated.
She felt very excluded.
There's not a lot to do.
So in 2001, the 18-year-old set off for Sin City.
Las Vegas is a place where you can find pretty much whatever you want.
But then, an unspeakable crime.
He was stabbed in the scrotum.
This was a rage killing.
The penis was completely amputated.
Left some people certain that a horrible secret from her past had come back to haunt her.
She snapped, flew into a violent rage.
You don't know how hard it is to know that you hurt somebody and you don't even remember it.
And left others convinced that she was simply a victim of mistaken identity.
This is the worst example of a miscarriage of justice that I've ever seen.
Las Vegas, Nevada, July 8, 2001. It was around 10 p.m. on Sunday evening when a homeless man went snooping around the dumpster enclosure behind a bank branch a few blocks west of Sin City's famed strip.
There's a chain link fence across the top of it, and then there's doors on the front that are supposed to be locked.
But that night, the doors were unlocked.
He decided to go in there and what we call dumpster dive.
But once he started sifting through the trash, the homeless man soon found far more than he had bargained for. A dead body.
He had blunt trauma to his head, and he also had a knife wound to his neck.
Shocked by the discovery, the homeless man contacted the police.
He went across the street and called 911 from a payphone.
And soon the quiet commercial area was filled with flashing lights and emergency vehicles.
The area was taped off by police officers, and then their homicide detectives came out.
They were faced with a daunting task. The victim, an African-American male in his mid-40s, had no ID.
They actually had no idea who this person was.
However, while the investigators couldn't identify the victim, they could do something. Despite the fact that the body had been found next to a dumpster, less than 5 minutes from the strip, they quickly ruled out a professional killing.
There are bloody footprints all over the crime scene.
They checked the person who first called in the crime. They checked his shoes, and they didn't match, and there was no blood on them.
And the fact that the killer had left clues behind wasn't the only thing that suggested this wasn't a professional hit. Once they examined the body, the investigators realized that whoever the killer was, they apparently had a very personal grudge with the victim.
His penis was severed.
And the investigation would ultimately lead them to a troubled young woman with a disturbing secret. Born in 1982, Kirstin Blaze Lobato's early childhood wasn't exactly stable.
Her mother and father were divorced, and she was living with her mother and her mother's boyfriend.
But then, when Kirstin was 5 years old, her mother's boyfriend went to prison. Soon after, the courts removed Kirstin from her mother's custody.
And so she had gone to live with her dad and stepmother.
Once she settled into her father's suburban Las Vegas home, the 5-year-old thrived in the new environment and grew close to her dad.
They played sports together and did a lot of boy things together because he wanted a boy. So she's a bit of a tomboy.
And just before Kirstin started high school, the family left suburban Las Vegas and moved 165 miles northeast to what on the surface appeared to be a tomboy's paradise, the tiny desert town of Panaca, Nevada.
Panaca is an incredibly small town, probably the smallest town I've ever been to.
It's a farming community in the middle of nowhere. There are about 700 people who live there.
You can go for miles and miles and not see a person.
In some ways, The tomboy from the big city enjoyed all the wide open space and freedom that her new home offered.
She went out riding dirt bikes.
She loved to go ride four-wheelers. She was kind of wild, kind of adventurous.
But in other ways, 14-year-old Kirstin found the small town stifling. Most of the 700 people in Panaca were strict Mormons.
We got more churches than schools.
There's a curfew at 10 o'clock. You have to be in your house.
At first, Kirstin tried hard to be accepted in her new town.
She was really nice. She was friendly to everybody.
But it was tough being one of the few non-Mormon teens in town.
She was a bit of a, free thinker, a little bit different than everyone else.
She didn't get along quite so great with some of the more conservative students in her class.
And before long, Kirstin's treks out into the desert on her four-wheeler took on a new purpose. They became her means to escape the taunts and bullying she suffered at school.
She felt very excluded. She always felt as an outsider.
Although she wasn't completely shunned. As one of the few non-Mormon girls in school, Kirstin proved quite popular with the boys.
She was very promiscuous.
And in a tiny town like Panaca, it didn't take long before that was common knowledge too.
She was kind of viewed as a rebellious, wild child.
She definitely wasn't in the good boys clique. She was kind of a bad girl.
And as she grew older, Kirstin began to revel in her role as the scandalous outsider. When she got her first car, for instance.
Her license plate was fornicator.
It said 4NIK8ER, adolescent humor.
Kirstin may have found it funny, but her conservative classmates didn't. And as the teen grew older, their taunts and bullying increased until a fellow student finally pushed her too far, and the 15-year-old did something that cemented her bad girl reputation for good.
She pulled a knife on somebody.
The incident earned Kirstin juvenile probation and a transfer into the county's alternative education program.
It was like an alternative school.
Basically getting a GED.
And it was while attending the alternative school that Kirstin finally made a friend in Panaca, the program's counselor and teacher, Dixie Tenkin.
Dixie was kind of known as sort of a local free spirit.
And unlike most of the people in Panaca, Dixie managed to connect with the troubled teen.
Dixie Tenkin would listen without being judgmental.
The two women soon grew close, and thanks to Dixie's guidance, Kirstin managed to earn her diploma in May of 2000.
She did by the skin of her teeth.
17 years old and finally finished with high school, Kirstin wasted no time in getting out of Panaca. And this time she went much further than a jaunt out into the desert on her four-wheeler. Fed up with small-town life, Kirstin was heading home.
She thought, I've graduated from high school. I'm heading to Vegas and make my fortune.
And in May, Kirstin set off for Vegas, even though she didn't have a permanent place to live.
She was sort of couch hopping, meeting people and sleeping on their couch.
And unlike Panaca, making friends wasn't a problem. After years feeling like an outcast in the desert, Kirstin found Las Vegas accepting.
She's a very social and charismatic young lady.
She's very warm, friendly, she's funny.
It's a cliche, but she walks in the room and people gravitate toward her.
Making money wasn't hard either. Vegas offered plenty of opportunities for an attractive young woman to earn extra cash.
She was working at a strip club.
I know it sounds kind of strange, but in Las Vegas, that's sort of a rite of passage, something that young girls do because they're grown up now.
For the next year, Kirstin spent most of her time in Vegas, eventually settling into a rent-by-the-week motel east of the Strip and sampling everything the city had to offer.
Las Vegas is a place where you can find pretty much whatever you want at any hour that you want.
It was a extended vacation.
She did occasionally return to Panaca, though, to do a little laundry and see her parents.
It's a several-hour drive, but she did have a fairly close relationship with her parents.
But when Kirstin returned to Panaca in early July, she hadn't come home to do laundry or raid her parents' pantry.
She returns home to Panaca, pretty much shattered and stunned.
And she told her dad and stepmom that she had come home to stay. The 18-year-old said she wasn't going back to Vegas, ever.
Kirstin says, this is not me, this is not where I want to go, this is not what I want to do in my life.
She had pretty much returned to some kind of normalcy she had before she went down to Vegas.
But unfortunately for Kirstin, what happens in Vegas doesn't always stay there. On the evening of July 8, 2001, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police responded to a call reporting a man's dead body behind a dumpster less than 5 minutes west of Sin City's glittering Strip.
If you just drive less than 2 minutes, you'll be at Caesar's Palace.
However, despite the proximity to the casinos, the murder didn't have the hallmarks of a gambling debt gone bad or a professional hit.
They find shoe prints in blood leading away from the crime scene.
Instead, the investigators at the scene quickly surmised that the murder was the result of a personal vendetta.
This was a rage killing. He has been stabbed in the chest multiple times. He has been beaten about the face. He has had his teeth knocked out.
And most shocking of all,
The penis was completely amputated.
the investigators had no idea just how the man had ended up dead behind the dumpster.
There were no witnesses.
In fact, they didn't even know the victim's name.
He went to the morgue as a John Doe.
And the one obvious clue the investigators did have, the bloody footprints at the crime scene, weren't much to go on.
They were men's size 10 shoes, manufactured by Walmart.
So once the body was removed, the investigators got down to the grimy and daunting task of sifting through the dumpster for evidence.
You don't know what to take and what to leave, what's trash and what's evidence.
Anything that looked out of place, that looked like it might not just be trash, they would collect that. And it was very meticulous what they did.
Meticulous and gruesome.
The amputated penis was actually found about 2.5 hours later and had to be taken to the morgue separately.
And after a few hours of work by the CSI crew, the investigators were able to piece together some vital information about the crime, too.
He obviously died at the scene. There was a significant amount of blood there.
But the real breakthrough came from the crowd of curious onlookers that gathered outside the crime scene tape.
The police have crowd control, and this woman goes up to one of the police officers and asks what happened. The police said that someone was murdered. And the woman asks, is that St. Louis?
This man, St. Louis, was her friend. They used drugs together, specifically crack.
He was known to live and stay in that dumpster.
And when the investigators showed photographs of the victim to the woman, whose name was Diane Parker, she confirmed that he was indeed the man she knew as St. Louis, 44-year-old Duran Bailey.
St. Louis is Mr. Bailey's street name.
Running Bailey's real name through the database revealed that he had a history of trouble with the law.
He had a record for domestic violence. He also had arrests for trespassing. He had arrests for possession of crack cocaine.
He was really street smart. and very tough.
According to Diane, Duran Bailey was also a small-time dealer, although in her case, the transactions weren't always cash.
She had traded sex for drugs with him.
However, the angry woman told the investigators that Bailey hadn't always held up his end of the deal. In fact, Diane said that Bailey had basically raped her just days before his death.
Says, I didn't get the drugs I was promised and he beat me up.
The incident had occurred about 2 weeks before Bailey had been found dead in the dumpster.
She had filed a police report.
But the investigation had gone nowhere.
She was taken for a sex assault exam, and then when they were trying to get names of witnesses she could talk to, she didn't want to cooperate anymore.
She was saying to them, you're going to get me killed. He's going to come back and kill me because because I'm telling you this.
However, now that Bailey had been killed, the police couldn't help but wonder, was his murder somehow connected to the alleged rape?
This crime was personal. Somebody was really, really mad at this guy.
So they immediately, when they got that information, the investigators spoke to her, went to her apartment, spoke to her roommate as well. They asked if they could see their shoes, etc.
But despite the promising lead, the investigators could find no trace of blood or anything else that suggested either Parker or her roommate had been involved in a violent struggle.
There was nothing about that situation that led them to believe that they were involved in the crime whatsoever.
Diane Parker appeared to be a dead end. So with no other leads to go on, the investigators awaited the results of Duran Bailey's autopsy, even if it was unlikely that the results would give them anything to go on, considering the contaminated nature of the crime scene.
You have a body that's found under mounds and mounds of trash, so you have hundreds of people's DNA in the trash.
Conducted on July 9th, the day after his body had been found, the autopsy revealed that Duran Bailey had been dead behind the dumpster for between 8 and 18 hours.
Full rigor mortis had set in.
His death hadn't been quick, however. According to the medical examiner, Bailey had been tortured.
While he was alive, he was stabbed in the scrotum.
Although his most gruesome injury hadn't been inflicted until after he was dead.
The genital was severed post-mortem.
That wasn't the only torture Duran Bailey had suffered, though. Based on the autopsy's findings, it appeared that the accused rapist had also been raped.
There was semen in the victim.
Assuming that the rapist was also Bailey's killer, the fact that he'd left DNA behind meant the investigators could theoretically confirm his identity, assuming they found a suspect to compare the profile to. And that, unfortunately, was a very big if.
There weren't any good suspects.
And more than a week after Duran Bailey's body had been found, the police were running out of options.
The case went cold.
But then, on July 20th, the Las Vegas Homicide Division received an unexpected phone call from a probation officer from Lincoln County, Nevada. A phone call that turned their cold case red hot.
The probation officer had called to inquire whether or not there had been any crimes that involved a penis being cut off.
Of course, the answer is yes, we do.
Not that it was common knowledge. In fact, it hadn't been reported in the press.
The fact that a man's penis had been severed was not put out in the press release regarding the crime because that's a very unique fact. They want to hold back so that if somebody does come forward about the crime, they have a detail that would show they're truthful.
But while the probation officer appeared to know the details about Bailey's death, she told the investigators that the information had come to her secondhand from a woman named Dixie Tenkin, a teacher and counselor in the tiny farming town of Panaca.
It being such a small town, everybody just knew everybody.
According to what she had told the probation officer, one of Dixie's former students had recently come to her with a shocking story about an attempted rape in Las Vegas.
She's telling this counselor that this guy came up to her near her apartment and had his pants down.
However, the young woman told the counselor that she had fought back.
She carried a knife on her, and when this guy dragged her down, she cut him.
Actually, according to what the young woman allegedly told the counselor, she'd done far more than just cut him.
She cut off his penis.
It was the breakthrough that the police had been waiting for.
It obviously matched our crime.
It wasn't a perfect match, though. Evidence from the autopsy suggested Bailey's killer was a man, but it was the investigators' only lead, and it led them straight to a troubled 18-year-old named Kirstin Lobato. On the afternoon of July 20th, 2001, Las Vegas homicide detectives arrived in the tiny farming town of Panaca, Nevada, 165 miles and a world away from the glitz and glamour of Sin City. For almost 3 weeks, the Las Vegas Metro Police had been stumped by the brutal murder of a homeless man and small-time drug dealer named Duran Bailey.
Duran Bailey's body was discovered by a homeless guy.
He had been beaten, stabbed, and dismembered.
He had his penis removed with a knife.
The investigators had exhausted all available leads until earlier that day, when they received a phone call from a probation officer whose district included Panaca. A phone call that gave the police their first big break in the case.
She said, "There's a girl up here who says that she cut a man's penis during a rape attempt."
The girl's name was Kirstin Lobato. And despite the fact that forensic evidence from the autopsy suggested that Duran Bailey's killer was a man, Las Vegas investigators were knocking on her door within hours of the call.
They went straight up, took a taped statement from the probation officer, and then went over to Lobato's house to speak to her.
At first, Kirstin wasn't eager to talk.
She wasn't very cooperative.
But then, when the investigators told her why they were there,
they tell her that the man who had attacked her died.
Kirstin began to cry.
She sounds almost relieved. Thank God the police are here. Now I'm gonna be okay.
But Kirstin wouldn't be okay, because the investigators figured her tears confirmed what they suspected, that she'd killed and mutilated Duran Bailey. When an African-American man had suddenly attacked her in the hotel parking lot.
He came out of nowhere and grabbed his computer.
She stated that he forced her down on the ground, was trying to hike her skirt up, and she felt that he was going to try and rape her.
That's all he had to do was remove my underwear. That's all there was to it.
Kirstin said that she had tried to scream, but that had only made her attacker more violent.
He slapped in my face when I was crying and told me to shut up.
Kirstin Lobato was terrified, frightened out of her very mind.
And according to Kirstin, she had more reason to be frightened than most people. She told the investigators that she had been sexually abused as a child.
When I was 5 years old, I was tortured every day for a year by my mother's boyfriend.
That was why her mother's boyfriend had gone to prison, why she had gone to live with her father. And according to Kirstin, she had carried those psychological scars with her the rest of her life.
The shame associated with it goes so deep.
She had a lot of anger and a lot of rage in her.
Rage that had boiled over when someone, presumably Duran Bailey, grabbed her that night in the dark parking lot.
She made it very clear that nothing like that was ever going to happen to her again.
And she had been prepared to do something about it, too.
Kirstin was carrying a knife.
It was sharp. Knife.
And with the man on top of her, his pants down and his genitals exposed, Kirstin said she had pulled out her knife and swiftly turned the tables on her attacker.
I ran for as much as I could hold down there.
She swung at him and said that she hit his penis with the knife.
I was trying to have it off.
Whether she had succeeded, Kirstin said she wasn't sure. In fact, she claimed that given her panic at the time, the details were fuzzy.
Everything was black. From my mom, I don't really remember a lot. I don't know what I did after that.
Although according to what she told the police, her sudden counterattack had brought the rape attempt to an abrupt end.
She was able actually to get the man off of her.
Was he making any noise at that point?
He was crying.
She specifically said that the man was alive when she left.
So how had he ended up behind the dumpster?
Do you remember any area involving a dumpster at all?
Well, there was a dumpster not far from where it happened, but I don't remember anything in it or anything.
All Kirstin knew was that as soon as she slashed her attacker, she had run.
She got in her car and left as fast as she could to get away from there.
According to Kirstin, she had tossed the knife out the window as she drove, along with her clothes.
She says that she's covered in blood.
I don't know where I dumped it at. I just remember throwing it. I was naked in my car.
But did Kirstin's story mean that she had killed Duran Bailey? Obviously, one major detail matched up.
She took out a knife and she cut his penis. And they had a body that had a severed penis.
But there were other things about her story that didn't quite fit.
She's talking about a physical location that doesn't meet the description of where this murder took place.
Mr. Bailey was killed in the parking lot of a bank. She keeps talking about an incident that happened at the apartments in which she lived.
The two locations were more than 7 miles apart. And according to Kirstin, she'd also slashed at her attacker's genitals first, which didn't match the findings of Duran Bailey's autopsy.
The severing of the penis was post-mortem.
And her story definitely didn't fit with the final piece of evidence that the autopsy revealed.
The semen says an unknown male was there.
Was it possible a different man had attacked Kirstin? That the attacker she had left bloody and possibly dismembered wasn't Duran Bailey? When the investigators tried to pin down the timeline of her alleged attack, she claimed it had happened several weeks before Bailey's body had been found.
This has already been over a month ago.
Although once again, she admitted that her recollection was fuzzy. Because as it turned out, the fact that she had been molested as a child wasn't her only secret.
She admits that she's been on methamphetamine.
In fact, Kirstin said that's why she had turned to stripping and more.
I got up on stage with one of the other girls wearing a cage. I'm not proud to admit that, but I did that to make money to pay for it.
She was basically desperate for money.
And according to Kirstin, at the time of the attack, she had been high on meth for several days straight.
From about a week before then until about a week afterwards, I was out of my mind on drugs.
And as far as the authorities were concerned, the fact that she admitted to being high was more than enough to explain the inconsistencies in her story.
That's very typical that they might not remember everything.
And the physical evidence, such as the semen and the man's footprints at the crime scene, the police wrote them off as unrelated to the murder.
Those bloody footprints could have just been somebody not related to the crime.
Meaning the authorities figured that Duran Bailey's murder was all but solved.
We had one body with a severed penis, and we had one girl who had told somebody, I cut it off.
So when Kirstin finished her story, the investigators pulled out their handcuffs and placed her under arrest without incident.
Her father asked, can I give her a hug and kiss goodbye? They said yes, and then she said to him, I'm sorry, Dad.
She was sobbing that she had taken a human life.
You don't know how hard it is to know that you hurt somebody and you don't even remember it.
On May 2nd, 2002, 19-year-old Kirstin Lobato sat in a Las Vegas courtroom on trial for first-degree murder. She was charged with the brutal July 2001 slaying of a homeless man and small-time drug dealer named Duran Bailey.
It was horrible. You have this man who's just beaten and dismembered. It's a gruesome scene.
The crime had gone unsolved until the police received a tip from a parole officer in Lincoln County, Nevada, claiming that Kirstin had confessed to something eerily similar to Duran Bailey's death.
She explained that she was attacked, and so she pulled out her butterfly knife and she cut off his penis.
Questioned by the police, Kirstin had confirmed the parole officer's story, although she swore she had acted in self-defense and that her attacker was still alive when she fled. In addition, Kirstin had never identified her attacker as Duran Bailey, and she claimed that her assault had occurred well before the homeless man's death.
Mr. Bailey was killed on July 8th of 2001, and she's talking about something that happens, almost 6 weeks before.
If you really look at the facts of this case, there's only 3 things in common with Kirstin's attack and Duran Bailey's murder, and that is black man, penis, and knife. That's it.
Although the prosecution claimed there was one more thing that Kirstin and Duran Bailey had in common, and during opening statements, the prosecutor argued that it explained the discrepancies between Kirstin's confession and Duran Bailey's death.
When you're dealing with somebody who's high on methamphetamine, most likely they're not going to remember the exact date.
The prosecutor also said that Kirstin's drug habit explained how she had come into contact with the homeless man, a known dealer.
She craved meth all the time.
But according to the prosecution's theory, when Kirstin attempted to buy drugs from Duran Bailey, he had offered the sometime exotic dancer a special deal.
The state says that he essentially solicited her for sex in exchange for methamphetamine.
It was a fatal mistake, according to the prosecutors. Duran Bailey didn't know it, but Kirstin had been sexually abused as a child.
The prosecution's theory was that Kirstin was so angry as a victim of sexual assault in the past that when she was propositioned by Duran Bailey, she snapped. She flew into a violent rage and brutally mutilated this man.
That's what the prosecution claimed. But when the defense presented its open, they argued that the prosecution had no proof.
There is no evidence tying her to the crime scene.
Her DNA is not found at the scene anywhere.
In fact, as the defense repeatedly pointed out, the only DNA evidence found at the crime scene couldn't be Kirstin's.
Duran Bailey had semen in his rectum.
And that made for a clear case of reasonable doubt, according to the defense.
There was a man at this crime scene, and that man has never been identified.
But when the prosecutors started presenting their case against Kirstin, they argued that the physical evidence didn't matter.
Nobody else confessed to severing a penis.
And the prosecutors claimed that her victim had to be Duran Bailey. After Kirstin's confession, the investigators had conducted an exhaustive search of hospital records in the Las Vegas area.
If somebody has been attacked and had their penis cut, let alone severed, they'd have to seek medical treatment.
But no one had, according to the prosecutors.
Their whole reasoning was that nobody else turned up, dismembered literally like this. Therefore, she was talking about Duran Bailey.
And finally, the prosecution claimed that the police and her former counselor weren't the only people Kirstin had confessed to. They wrapped up their case by calling one of her former cellmates to the stand. The cellmate testified that Kirstin did know Duran Bailey.
A person who was jailed with her said that the defendant, Lobato, had told her that she was getting drugs for this guy.
But that wasn't all Kirstin had supposedly told her cellmate.
This woman says she did it. She killed this guy.
When it was the defense's turn, they did the only thing they felt they could. Put Kirstin on the stand and let the teenager tell her story.
Every jury wants to hear from the defendant.
In her testimony, Kirstin adamantly denied any involvement in the death of Duran Bailey.
Did you kill Duran Bailey?
No, I did not.
Kirstin testified that she wasn't even in Vegas when Bailey was killed on July 8th.
I was in Panaca.
She also recounted the traumatic attack that had nearly led to her rape.
She was like kind of crying and trying to come across as sympathetic.
She did admit to slashing at her attacker, but according to Kirstin, the man she had slashed wasn't Duran Bailey. In fact, she said it couldn't have been.
She's talking about being attacked at the Budget Suites on the east side of Las Vegas.
Where Mr. Bailey's body was found, and clearly where the homicide occurred, was on the west side of town.
And Kirstin testified that she was already in handcuffs by the time she figured out the police were questioning her about a different incident.
She never said, I killed that man. She never said she killed anybody. They told her she killed somebody. She believed them and she said, oh my God, I can't believe I did that.
However, the prosecution wasn't about to chalk their whole case up to mistaken identity.
It's the state's theory that there was not another attack.
And when it was their turn to cross-examine Kirstin, the prosecutors went after the former drug addict hard.
The prosecution kept hammering that this is a drug user who doesn't know what she's talking about.
But would Kirstin's drug addiction be enough to cost her the jury's sympathy? On May 19th, after hours of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict.
Was guilty on all charges.
Kirstin and her attorneys were devastated.
All of us were stunned. I was in such a state of shock.
The judge sentenced the 19-year-old to 100 years in prison.
This is the worst example of a miscarriage of justice that I've ever seen.
Quite a few people agreed, too. After Kirstin's sentencing, web pages and petitions appeared demanding that she receive a new trial.
It's really important for women who understand the experience and the terror of sexual assault to band together and support a woman when she's victimized by the legal system.
And in September of 2004, Kirstin and her supporters got their wish when evidence surfaced proving that the prosecution's jailhouse snitch had lied during her testimony.
But it turned out she had a lot of credibility issues.
As a result, the judge overturned Kirstin's conviction.
Kirstin was given a new trial and a new day in court.
Released on bail in December of 2005, Kirstin spent less than a year out of jail before facing a jury for the second time on September 11, 2006. In opening statements, the prosecution stood by their theory that Kirstin had killed Duran Bailey during a drug deal.
She'd been using drugs. When you're a consistent user, bad things are going to happen.
But while the prosecution no longer had her cellmate's testimony, they had managed to debunk one vital piece of evidence that the defense counted on to raise reasonable doubt.
I've had supporters of Lobato say to me, well, why don't you test the sperm that was found? It was tested. It was the victim's.
How the semen got there was anyone's guess. But according to the prosecution, the fact that it was Duran Bailey's meant there was no mystery man, no would-be killer other than Kirstin.
There's not this unknown DNA out there that could be the real killer.
It was a tough blow for the defense. But the fact that the jailhouse snitch had been discredited did strengthen their argument that the prosecution still had no direct evidence that Kirstin had killed or even known Duran Bailey.
Kirstin has no connection to Duran Bailey, never has had a connection to Duran Bailey.
However, Kirstin's cellmate wouldn't be the only witness noticeably absent. After her disastrous testimony in 2002, the defense wrapped their case without putting Kirstin on the stand.
Merely sitting in the defendant's chair causes the jury to have a certain bias against you.
On October 6, 2006, Kirstin Lobato awaited her fate in a Las Vegas courtroom. Already convicted once in the July 2001 murder of Duran Bailey, that verdict had been overturned. And rightly so, according to the 23-year-old's many supporters.
Kirstin Blaze Lobato was a victim of an attempted sexual assault who was framed for the sexual mutilation murder of a different man.
And now, after less than a year of freedom, Kirstin's fate depended on whether or not the second jury agreed.
The feeling about the second trial was pretty positive in favor of Kirstin's defense.
I was absolutely convinced that they were going to come back with her being not guilty.
And to an extent, her supporters were right. The second jury didn't find Kirstin guilty of murder, but they didn't exactly exonerate her either.
The jury came back with voluntary manslaughter.
They compromised, thinking maybe it was some sort of attack or history played into it.
It may have been a compromise, but it was still a travesty as far as Kirstin's supporters were concerned.
People who had worked so hard on her case were, obviously dismayed.
I just remember feeling kind of faint. Your knees get weak. I mean, she was innocent.
And Kirstin, after 4 long years and so much hope, was devastated.
She simply hung her head and started to cry.
But for the prosecution, 2 guilty verdicts were more than enough to prove that Kirstin was Duran Bailey's killer.
You have 24 people who heard the case and 24 people who rejected her alibi.
After her conviction, Kirstin received a sentence of 13 to 35 years in prison.
I still have that picture in my head of them putting her in handcuffs and taking her away.
But even after her second conviction, Kirstin's support continues to grow.
There is a lot more interest in this case.
And her supporters say they won't give up until justice is done.
I'm not going to be quiet until she's released.
She is in prison for something she did not do.
Being punished for something that you didn't do is the height of unfairness.
There are murder cases that end with a conviction. There are murder cases that end with an acquittal. And then there are the rare cases that continue to haunt a nation long after the crime itself has faded into history. Cases where technology advances, evidence emerges, and yet the legal system can no longer act. The murder of Frederik von Mollman belongs to that final category. This is a story that begins on an ordinary autumn evening in West Germany. A teenager leaves choir practice and tries to find a way home. It is a decision so ordinary that thousands of young people made the same choice every week. There is no sign of danger, no indication that anything is wrong, no warning that within a few hours, a family would begin a desperate search. A community would be plunged into fear, and a legal battle would begin that would last more than 40 years. At the center of the story is a 17-year-old girl named Frederik von Mollman. And surrounding her story is a question that continues to divide lawyers, judges, investigators, politicians, and ordinary citizens even today. What happens when science discovers the truth decades too late? What happens when evidence finally appears, but the law says it can no longer be used? And perhaps most troubling of all, what happens when a murder case reaches a point where justice and legality no longer seem to point in the same direction? To understand why the name Frederik von Mollman became known across Germany, we have to travel back to the evening of November 4th, 1981. West Germany in the early 1980s was a different place from the world we know today. Mobile phones did not exist. Surveillance cameras were rare. DNA testing was not yet part of criminal investigations. In many communities, people still believed they could trust strangers. Young people frequently traveled alone. Hitchhiking was not considered unusual. It was often seen as a practical solution when buses stopped running and trains were unavailable. On that November evening, Frederik attended choir practice in the city of Celle, a historic town in Lower Saxony. Music was an important part of her life. Friends and family later described her as diligent, reliable, and deeply involved in her church community. Nothing about that evening appeared extraordinary. But ordinary moments often become the most important moments in true crime history. When choir practice ended, Frederik prepared to return home to the village of Oldau. The journey was not especially long. The distance was only around 10 kilometers. Under normal circumstances, she would have taken public transportation. But that night, she missed the final bus. It was a small inconvenience, the kind of thing most people experience and forget within a day. For Frederik, it became the final decision of her life. Investigators would later conclude that after missing her bus, she attempted to hitchhike home. At the time, there was little reason for her to view the choice as dangerous. Countless people had done the same thing before. Many arrived safely without ever giving the experience a second thought. Somewhere between Celle and Oldau, however, Frederik entered a vehicle that would never bring her home. No dramatic struggle was witnessed. No emergency call could be made. No surveillance footage recorded the encounter. There was only silence. As the evening turned into night, Frederik failed to return home. At first, Her family may have assumed there had been a delay. Perhaps she had found another ride. Perhaps she was waiting somewhere. Perhaps she would walk through the front door at any moment and explain what had happened. But as the hours passed, concern grew. Then concern became fear. When Frederike still had not returned, her family contacted authorities. What followed was every family's nightmare. A search operation began. Police officers, volunteers, and members of the community searched the surrounding area. Questions spread quickly through Cell and nearby villages. Had anyone seen her? Had anyone offered her a ride? Had anyone spoken to her after choir practice? The answers never came. Days passed. Each hour without news deepened the anxiety. Missing person investigations are often defined by uncertainty. Families exist in a painful space between hope and dread. Every telephone call feels significant. Every rumor matters. Every possible lead becomes something to cling to. For 4 days, Frederike's family lived inside that uncertainty. Then came the discovery that would change everything. Her body was found in woodland near Hambron. The search for a missing girl instantly became a homicide investigation. The details were horrifying. The teenager had been sexually assaulted. She had been attacked with a knife. She had been murdered. Her body had been left in the forest, hidden away from the roads and communities where she had once lived her ordinary life. The crime shocked the region. In towns and villages throughout the area, people struggled to understand how such violence could occur. Parents looked at their children differently. Young women reconsidered routines they had never questioned before. The idea that a teenager could leave a choir rehearsal and never return home struck at something fundamental, a sense of safety that many had assumed existed. Investigators immediately began collecting evidence. At the crime scene, they found tire tracks. They recovered fibers. They documented physical traces that appeared connected to a vehicle. They also preserved biological evidence. At the time, nobody realized how important that final category would eventually become. In 1981, forensic science operated within limitations that are difficult to imagine today. DNA analysis had not yet revolutionized criminal investigations. Biological samples could be collected and stored, but investigators lacked the technology to unlock the information hidden inside them. Evidence existed. The ability to fully understand that evidence did not. As police worked through the case, attention eventually focused on a young man from Cell named Ismet H. Investigators believed they had enough information to connect him to the crime. A prosecution followed. A trial followed. And initially, it appeared that the justice system had reached a conclusion. The suspect was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. For Frederike's family, it seemed that accountability had finally arrived. But the story was far from over, because the conviction would not survive. On appeal, higher courts examined the evidence and identified weaknesses. Questions emerged regarding the reliability of key elements of the prosecution's case. The investigation had produced suspicion. It had produced circumstantial evidence. But had it produced certainty? In criminal law, certainty matters. Eventually, the conviction was overturned. The suspect was acquitted. Legally speaking, the case appeared finished. Yet for one man, it never truly ended. Frederike's father, Hans von Mollman, refused to accept that the search for answers was over. Year after year, decade after decade, he continued pushing authorities to revisit the evidence. While public attention faded and the world changed around him, he continued believing that the truth had not yet fully emerged. Then, more than 30 years after Frederike's murder, science finally caught up with the evidence collected in 1981. The preserved biological samples were examined using modern DNA technology. The results stunned investigators. What had once been impossible to analyze now produced answers. And those answers appear to point directly back toward the same man who had once stood trial for Frederik's murder. For many observers, it seemed as though the mystery had finally been solved. But that was when the most extraordinary chapter of the story began. Because identifying a suspect and convicting a suspect are not the same thing. A legal principle known as ini bis in idem, the prohibition against being tried twice for the same offense after a final acquittal, stood in the way. The DNA evidence arrived. The legal system listened. And then Germany found itself confronting an uncomfortable question. Should new scientific evidence be allowed to reopen a case that the courts had already closed decades earlier? Or should the finality of an acquittal remain absolute? Even when modern technology reveals information that judges in the 1980s could never have seen, the debate would eventually reach lawmakers. It would reach prosecutors. It would reach Germany's highest constitutional court. And through it all, one fact remained unchanged. A 17-year-old girl had left choir practice expecting to go home. She never arrived. More than 4 decades later, her murder remains one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern German history, not simply because of the crime itself, but because of what happened afterward. This is the story of Frederik von Mollman, a story of loss, a story of persistence, a story of science arriving decades too late, and a story that forces us to confront one of the most difficult questions any justice system can face. If the truth finally emerges after the law has already spoken, which one should prevail? Before a crime becomes a headline, before investigators begin collecting evidence, before lawyers argue in courtrooms and judges issue rulings, there's always a person at the center of the story. A life, a family, a future that existed before everything changed. In the case of Frederik von Mollman, it is easy to become absorbed by the legal controversy that would later make her murder one of the most debated criminal cases in modern German history. The DNA evidence, the acquittal, the constitutional arguments, the decades-long battle over justice. Yet long before any of those events unfolded, Frederik was simply a 17-year-old girl living an ordinary life in rural West Germany. To understand the true weight of this case, it is important to begin there. Frederik von Mollman was born in 1964 and grew up in Oldau, a small village near the city of Celle in Lower Saxony. It was the kind of community where people often knew one another, where routines were familiar, and where life moved at a pace very different from that of larger cities. The landscape surrounding the area consisted of fields, forests, quiet roads, and small settlements connected by regional transportation routes. For many families, it was a place associated with stability and security. Friends and relatives described Frederik as a diligent and responsible young woman. She was known for her interest in music and her involvement in a church choir. Music was not merely a hobby, but an important part of her routine and social life. Choir rehearsals brought together young people from the community and neighboring areas, creating a sense of belonging and purpose. Those who knew her remembered a teenager focused on the ordinary concerns of youth, school, friendships, family responsibilities, and plans for the future. Nothing in the available record suggests that Frederik lived a particularly risky life or sought dangerous situations. On the contrary, she appears to have been deeply integrated into her family and community. This fact would later make the circumstances of her death even more shocking. There was no obvious reason for her to become the victim of a violent crime. The world in which Frederik lived was also very different from the one most people inhabit today. Looking back from a modern perspective, it is difficult to fully appreciate how much everyday life has changed since 1981. Today, many people carry smartphones capable of sharing their location in real time. Surveillance cameras monitor public spaces. GPS systems document travel routes. Social media allows family members to communicate instantly. If a teenager fails to arrive home, there are often numerous digital traces that can help reconstruct their movements. In 1981, none of those tools existed. People relied on landline telephones, handwritten schedules, and personal trust. Transportation systems were less interconnected. Communication was slower. Information traveled through conversations, not notifications. Perhaps most importantly, attitudes toward personal safety were different. During that period, hitchhiking remained relatively common in many parts of West Germany. Young people frequently accepted rides from strangers when buses or trains were unavailable. While there were certainly risks, those risks were often perceived differently than they are today. For many people, accepting a ride was viewed as practical rather than dangerous. This cultural context is crucial because it helps explain the decision Frederik would make on the evening of November 4th. 1981. Viewed through the lens of modern true crime awareness, hitchhiking can appear inherently risky. But in the environment in which Frederik lived, the decision was not extraordinary. It was a choice countless others had made before without incident. November 4th began as an ordinary day. There was nothing to indicate that it would become one of the most infamous dates in the history of German criminal justice. Like many evenings before, Frederik attended choir practice in Celle. The city, known for its historic architecture and long history, served as an important center for the surrounding region. People regularly traveled there for work, education, shopping, and community activities. Choir rehearsal was simply one part of Frederik's normal routine. At some point during the evening, the rehearsal concluded. Participants prepared to return home. For Frederik, that meant making the journey back to Oldau. Under normal circumstances, public transportation would have provided a straightforward route. But that evening, a small disruption occurred. She missed the final bus. On paper, it seems like such an insignificant event. Missing a bus is something that happens every day in every part of the world. Most of the time, it becomes a minor inconvenience and nothing more. Yet history is filled with moments where seemingly trivial events alter the course of lives forever. Missing that final bus forced Frederik to make another decision. The distance home was only around 10 kilometers. Waiting indefinitely was not practical. Walking the entire route late at night was not ideal. Like many young people of the era, she apparently chose to hitchhike. Investigators would later conclude that this was the last known decision she made. It is impossible to know exactly what she was thinking in those moments. The available evidence does not reveal her private thoughts. But what is known is that nothing about the choice would necessarily have seemed alarming at the time. She was trying to get home. That was the objective. A simple ride. A short journey. An ordinary end to an ordinary evening. Somewhere after leaving Celle, Frederik was seen alive for the final time. That fact carries a haunting significance. At the moment of the last sighting, nobody present could have known its importance. Nobody knew they were witnessing the final chapter of a 17-year-old's life. Nobody knew that investigators would later attempt to reconstruct these moments in painstaking detail. Nobody knew that decades later journalists, legal scholars, and criminal investigators would still be discussing what happened next. What makes this portion of the story particularly tragic is its simplicity. There was no elaborate plan, no complicated conspiracy, no indication that Frederik was targeted because of who she was. The prevailing investigative theory would eventually suggest something far more frightening, that she became the victim of opportunity. According to investigators, there was no evidence that the offender knew Frederik personally before the crime. Instead, it appeared that circumstances placed a vulnerable young woman in the path of someone willing to exploit that vulnerability. Such crimes often leave communities struggling to understand what happened because they seem to violate basic assumptions about safety and fairness. People naturally look for explanations. They want to identify warning signs. They want to believe that tragedies can be prevented if only certain choices are avoided. But opportunity crimes are particularly unsettling because they suggest randomness. They suggest that an ordinary person engaged in ordinary behavior can suddenly encounter extraordinary violence. For Frederik's family, however, these broader questions were still far in the future. On the evening of November 4th, none of them knew they were approaching the worst moment of their lives. They simply expected their daughter to come home. As the hours passed, concern gradually replaced certainty. At first, there may have been plausible explanations. Perhaps transportation difficulties had delayed her. Perhaps she had found another way home. Perhaps she would arrive later than expected. But eventually the absence became impossible to ignore. Every family develops routines over years of shared life. People learn when loved ones are usually home. They recognize when something feels wrong. Frederik's failure to return home broke that routine. Anxiety began to grow. What had started as a normal evening was becoming something else entirely. Before long, her disappearance was reported. Family members and authorities began searching for answers. Yet at that stage, hope still existed. Missing person cases often end with reunions. Individuals are found safe. Explanations emerge. Families embrace loved ones and attempt to move forward. Nobody could yet know that this case would not follow that path. Nobody could know that within days the search would transform into a homicide investigation. Nobody could know that Frederik's name would one day become associated not only with a tragic murder, but also with one of the most profound legal debates in Germany's modern history. For now, she remained what she had always been, a daughter, a choir member, a teenager with a future still ahead of her, a young woman whose life had been defined by ordinary hopes and ordinary routines. And as the night deepened across the quiet roads between Celle and Oldau, that future was already slipping away, though no one yet realized it. The tragedy that would soon unfold was not merely the loss of a life. It was the loss of everything that life might have become. And before investigators found evidence, before courts weighed guilt and innocence, before DNA transformed the case decades later, there was simply an empty place at a family table and a growing fear that the young woman who should have been coming home was not coming home at all. The most difficult part of any true crime story is often the point where certainty ends and reconstruction begins. Investigators can collect evidence. Forensic experts can analyze physical traces. Witnesses can provide fragments of information. But in many cases, especially those that occur far from public view, there is no complete record of what happened. No camera captured the events. No surviving witness can describe every moment. Instead, detectives must piece together a timeline from the evidence left behind. In the case of Frederik von Mollman, the broad outline of the crime eventually became clear. Even if many individual moments remained forever hidden within the darkness of a November night in 1981. The last confirmed chapter of Frederik's life began when choir practice ended in Celle on the evening of November 4th. She was 17 years old. The night ahead should have been unremarkable. The route home to Oldau was familiar. Family members expected her return. There was no reason to believe she was in danger. Yet sometime after leaving the rehearsal, Frederik missed the final bus that would have taken her home. What happened next would become one of the most consequential decisions in the entire case. Unable to use public transportation, she apparently chose to hitchhike. At the time, this was not considered unusual. Thousands of young people throughout West Germany accepted rides from strangers when necessary. For most, the decision carried no lasting consequences. For Frederik, however, it brought her into contact with the person investigators would later believe was responsible for her death. Somewhere along the route between Celle and Oldau, Frederik entered a vehicle. The available evidence does not reveal exactly where she got into the car. It does not reveal the words exchanged between driver and passenger. It does not reveal whether she felt comfortable or uneasy. What investigators ultimately concluded was that she accepted a ride from a man she did not know. There is no evidence suggesting a prior relationship between Frederike and her attacker. This distinction is important because it shaped the entire direction of the investigation. Crimes committed by acquaintances often leave different kinds of evidence than crimes committed by strangers. In this case, authorities came to believe that Frederike was selected because of circumstance rather than personal history. She was alone. She needed transportation. She was vulnerable in a way she may not even have recognized. Investigators later developed a reconstruction of the events based on the available evidence. According to this reconstruction, the driver who picked up Frederike did not take her toward her home in Olddaw. Instead, he drove toward a more isolated area near Hambren. The landscape there was very different from the populated streets of Cell. Forests, rural roads, and sparsely populated surroundings created an environment where crimes could occur without immediate detection. Such locations often present challenges for investigators because they provide privacy for offenders and limit the number of potential witnesses. At some point during the journey, the situation changed from an ordinary ride into a violent criminal act. The precise sequence of events remains unknown, but forensic evidence later established several critical facts. Frederike was sexually assaulted. She was overpowered. She was unable to escape. The evidence indicated that the assault occurred before her death. For investigators, these findings transformed the case from a missing person investigation into the pursuit of a dangerous offender who had committed both sexual violence and murder. What happened in those moments can never be fully reconstructed. No one can know Frederike's thoughts. No one can know her attempts to survive. No one can know the exact progression of fear, confusion, resistance, or desperation she may have experienced. Responsible examination of true crime requires acknowledging these limits. The evidence reveals what occurred. It does not reveal every human experience contained within those events. What is known is that the attack escalated to lethal violence. Forensic findings showed that Frederike suffered fatal injuries inflicted with a knife. Some reports associated with the investigation describe severe wounds to the neck area as the cause of death. The attack was not accidental. It was not the result of a spontaneous mishap. It was a deliberate act of violence that ended the life of a 17-year-old girl. After the killing, the offender faced a decision. He could leave the body where the crime occurred, increasing the likelihood of immediate discovery, or he could attempt to conceal what he had done. Investigators concluded that he chose concealment. Frederike's body was transported or left within woodland near Hambren. The location was secluded. Trees and vegetation shielded the area from casual observation. The placement of the body suggested an effort to delay discovery and reduce the chance of immediate detection. Such actions are common in homicide cases where offenders hope time and distance will complicate investigations. Yet even carefully hidden crimes leave traces behind. Every movement creates evidence. Every action alters a scene. Every attempt to conceal a crime risks creating new clues. The offender may not have known it at the time, but evidence would remain at the scene and on the victim for decades. Some of that evidence would become crucial more than 30 years later. While the events near Hambren were unfolding, Frederike's family remained unaware of the tragedy that had already occurred. They simply knew that she had not returned home. As evening turned into night, concern began to grow. Families often recognize when something falls outside normal patterns. A missed arrival can initially be explained away. A transportation problem, an unexpected delay, a misunderstanding. But as more time passes, innocent explanations become harder to accept. For Frederike's relatives, the uncertainty became increasingly alarming. They knew her habits. They knew her routines. Her absence felt wrong. Eventually, authorities were notified, and efforts began to determine her whereabouts. The first phase of the case was still a search for a missing teenager. Investigators sought information about her movements after choir practice. They attempted to identify anyone who had seen her. Every missing person investigation begins with hope. The possibility remains that the person will be found alive. Officers follow leads. Volunteers assist in searches. Communities rally around affected families. During those first days, Frederik's family could not yet know what investigators would eventually discover. The search continued. Questions multiplied. Answers remained scarce. Then, for days after Frederik disappeared, the search reached its devastating conclusion. Her body was discovered in woodland near Hambron. The discovery instantly changed everything. The uncertainty that had defined the previous days vanished, replaced by a terrible certainty. Frederik was dead. News of the discovery spread rapidly throughout the region. Communities that had followed the search now confronted the reality of a homicide. The victim was not an anonymous stranger. She was a local teenager known through family, school, church, and community activities. The brutality of the crime intensified public reaction. The fact that a 17-year-old girl had been sexually assaulted and murdered after attempting to get home from choir practice challenged assumptions about safety and trust. Investigators arriving at the scene faced an enormous task. Every detail mattered. Tire marks, fibers, biological traces, disturbances in the environment, the position of the body, the surrounding terrain. Crime scenes are often described as silent witnesses. They cannot speak, yet they contain information about what occurred. In the Frederik von Mollman case, the scene contained evidence that would guide the investigation for years. Some clues appeared immediately significant. Others seemed less important at the time. Ironically, some of the most critical evidence would not reveal its true value until decades later, when advances in science finally allowed investigators to unlock information hidden since 1981. The discovery of Frederik's body marked the end of one search and the beginning of another. The search for a missing girl was over. The search for her killer had begun. Police now faced the challenge of identifying who had picked her up where the assault had occurred, how the victim had been transported, and whether physical evidence could lead them to a suspect. In the days ahead, investigators would begin assembling pieces of a complex puzzle. Tire tracks would be examined. Fibers would be compared. Vehicle-related evidence would be scrutinized. Witness statements would be collected. Gradually, attention would focus on a young man named Ismet H. At that moment, however, none of those developments had yet unfolded. There was only a crime scene in a forest near Hambron, a grieving family confronting unimaginable loss, and a community struggling to understand how an ordinary journey home had ended in such extraordinary violence. The tragedy of Frederik von Mollman was no longer a disappearance. It had become a murder investigation, and although investigators did not yet realize it, the evidence they collected during those first crucial days would eventually place this case at the center of one of the most significant legal controversies in modern German history. When investigators arrived at the woodland near Hambron where Frederik von Mollman's body had been discovered, they faced a challenge that is familiar in many homicide investigations, but especially difficult in crimes involving strangers. They had a victim. They had a crime scene. They had physical evidence. What they did not have was a clear explanation of who had committed the crime or how exactly the events of November 4th, 1981, had unfolded after Frederik disappeared from public view. The search for a missing teenager had ended. The search for a murderer was only beginning. In every major homicide investigation, the earliest hours are critical. Detectives understand that evidence can disappear, memories can fade, and opportunities can be lost if leads are not pursued quickly. The murder of a 17-year-old girl generated enormous pressure on law enforcement. The crime had shocked the region. Residents wanted answers. Frederik's family wanted answers. Investigators themselves wanted answers. Yet answers are rarely found all at once. Instead, they emerge piece by piece through a painstaking process of collecting, analyzing, and connecting fragments of information. The first task was to examine the crime scene in as much detail as possible. Officers documented the location where the body had been found. Specialists searched for anything that might identify the offender or reconstruct his movements. Among the items that attracted attention were tire tracks found near the area. Vehicle-related evidence often becomes important in rural homicide cases because cars are frequently used both to transport victims and to reach isolated locations. Detectives recognized that the tire impressions might help identify the type of vehicle involved or connect a suspect to the scene. In addition to the tire tracks, investigators recovered fibers and other physical traces. Such evidence may appear insignificant to the public, but detectives know that small details often become crucial later. A single fiber can establish contact between people or locations. A seemingly ordinary object can place a suspect where he claims never to have been. Every trace mattered because there were so few direct witnesses to the crime. Investigators also preserved biological material associated with the victim and the assault. At the time, this was standard procedure. Crime scene technicians collected whatever evidence might prove useful, even if they could not immediately determine how it would be analyzed. Looking back decades later, this decision would become one of the most important developments in the entire case. Yet in 1981, the investigators had no way of knowing that the evidence they carefully stored would one day become the centerpiece of a national legal controversy. The forensic science available at the time was limited compared to modern standards. Today, audiences familiar with crime documentaries often assume that DNA analysis is an ordinary part of every investigation. In 1981, that reality did not exist. Detectives could preserve biological samples, but they could not extract the genetic information that would later revolutionize criminal justice systems around the world. The evidence was there. The technology needed to fully interpret it was not. This limitation forced investigators to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is often misunderstood by the public. It is not necessarily weak evidence. Many criminal convictions are based largely on circumstantial proof. However, such cases require investigators to build a chain of facts that collectively point towards suspect. The challenge lies in ensuring that every link in that chain remains strong. If too many links are questioned, the entire case can begin to unravel. As detectives worked through the available evidence, their attention gradually focused on a young man named Ismet H. He lived in the Cell area and soon emerged as the primary suspect. The reasons investigators concentrated on him were connected to the evidence they had gathered. During the early stages of the investigation, authorities believed that certain physical traces pointed toward a BMW associated with him. Vehicle-related evidence appeared potentially significant. Additional investigative findings seemed to support the theory that he had been involved in the crime. As often happens in major cases, detectives began examining every aspect of the suspect's activities. They looked at his movements. They evaluated his explanations regarding the period during which Frederik disappeared. They attempted to determine whether the available evidence could place him in contact with the victim. Gradually, investigators became convinced they had identified the person responsible. From their perspective, the evidence formed a coherent picture. Frederik had disappeared after attempting to hitchhike. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Physical traces connected the crime to a vehicle. Investigative leads pointed toward Ismet H. Prosecutors eventually concluded that there was sufficient evidence to bring the case to trial. The decision reflected confidence in the investigative work that had been completed. Yet confidence and certainty are not always the same thing. This distinction would later become central to the case. when the prosecution presented its evidence. The court initially accepted the argument that Ismet H. was responsible for Frederik's rape and murder. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. For Frederik's family, this appeared to be the conclusion of a nightmare. Their daughter was gone, but at least the person believed responsible had been held accountable. In many criminal cases, this is where the story ends. A crime occurs. An investigation identifies a suspect. A conviction follows. Society moves on. The Frederik von Molman case did not follow that pattern. Instead, the next phase of the legal process transformed the entire trajectory of the case. Following the conviction, the defense challenged the verdict. Higher courts reviewed the evidence and the reasoning behind the conviction. Appeals serve a critical role within criminal justice systems because they help ensure that convictions are supported by legally sufficient evidence. Even in emotionally charged cases, courts must apply consistent standards. During this review process, questions began to emerge. Some judges and legal experts expressed concerns regarding the reliability of certain evidence. Particular attention focused on the tire track evidence. How definitive was it? Could it truly identify a specific vehicle? Could alternative explanations exist? These questions did not necessarily prove the suspect's innocence, but they raised doubts about whether the evidence met the threshold required for a criminal conviction. Other aspects of the prosecution's case faced similar scrutiny. The broader issue was not whether suspicion existed. The issue was whether the evidence could eliminate reasonable doubt. Criminal law in Germany, like criminal law in many democratic societies, operates according to a fundamental principle: when reasonable doubt remains, the defendant must receive the benefit of that doubt. This principle can be frustrating in emotionally powerful cases because it sometimes leads to outcomes that appear unsatisfying. Yet it exists to prevent wrongful convictions and to ensure that punishment is imposed only when guilt has been established to the required legal standard. Eventually, the higher court concluded that the evidence against Ismet H. was insufficiently certain. The conviction was overturned. Most significantly, he was acquitted. The decision transformed the case overnight. A man who had once been sentenced to life imprisonment now stood legally innocent of the crime. For Frederik's family, the verdict was devastating. The legal system had first told them that the offender had been identified and convicted. Now it was telling them that the evidence did not support that conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. The emotional impact was profound, yet the consequences extended far beyond the immediate disappointment. The acquittal became final. Under German law, this finality carried enormous significance. Once an acquittal becomes legally binding, the principle known as any bis in idem protects the acquitted individual from being tried again for the same offense. At the time, few people could have imagined how important that principle would eventually become. Years passed, then decades. Public attention gradually moved elsewhere. New crimes emerged. New investigations dominated headlines. Yet one person refused to let the case disappear. Frederik's father, Hans von Molman, never accepted that the search for justice was over. While others viewed the case as closed, he continued pushing for further examination of the evidence. He repeatedly urged authorities to revisit the material preserved from the original investigation. His persistence reflected a belief shared by many family members of homicide victims, that unanswered questions deserve continued attention, regardless of how much time has passed. As forensic science advanced during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, possibilities emerged that investigators in 1981 could never have imagined. DNA technology transformed criminal investigations worldwide. Cases once considered unsolvable suddenly produced answers. Innocent individuals were exonerated. Previously unidentified offenders were discovered. Cold cases that had sat dormant for decades returned to active investigation. In 2012, more than 30 years after Frederik's murder, Authorities re-examined biological evidence preserved from the original case. The results would change everything. Modern DNA analysis revealed that genetic material recovered from evidence associated with the crime matched Ismet H. Unlike the circumstantial evidence that had dominated the original prosecution, this was direct biological evidence. For investigators, the significance was enormous. DNA evidence carries a different evidentiary weight because it can establish physical contact in ways that earlier forensic techniques could not. The discovery sent shockwaves through legal and investigative circles. Suddenly, a case many considered closed appeared dramatically different. Detectives who reviewed the findings saw a connection between the suspect and evidence linked directly to the victim. Prosecutors recognized that if such evidence had been available during the original proceedings, the outcome might have been very different. Many observers reached the same conclusion. The question was no longer whether new evidence existed. The question became what could legally be done about it. For Frederik's family, the DNA findings represented something they had sought for more than 3 decades. Confirmation that modern science could shed new light on the crime. For legal scholars, however, the result created a profound dilemma. Scientific truth and legal finality were suddenly on a collision course. Investigators had spent years searching for answers. DNA technology appeared to provide some of those answers. Yet because of decisions made decades earlier, the legal system now faced a question unlike any it had confronted during the original investigation. Could a case that had already ended be reopened because science had finally caught up with the evidence? The answer would ultimately trigger one of the most important legal battles in modern German: criminal justice. But before that battle could unfold, Germany first had to confront an uncomfortable reality. The evidence that might have changed everything in 1982 had arrived 31 years too late. For many true crime cases, the investigation represents the most complex chapter. Detectives gather evidence, identify suspects, and gradually reconstruct the truth. The courtroom then serves as the place where those findings are tested and ultimately resolved. In the case of Frederik von Mollman, however, the courtroom became the beginning of an entirely different struggle, one that would outlast the original investigation by decades. The murder itself occurred in 1981. The legal questions it raised would continue into the 21st century. What began as a criminal prosecution would eventually evolve into a national debate about justice, constitutional rights, scientific progress, and the limits of the law itself. Following the investigation, prosecutors moved forward with the case against Ismet H. At the time, investigators believed they had assembled sufficient evidence to establish his responsibility for the rape and murder of Frederik. The prosecution's argument relied heavily on the physical evidence collected during the investigation and the connections authorities believed existed between the suspect and the crime scene. In court, prosecutors presented a narrative they believed explained what had happened on the night Frederik disappeared. The evidence, though largely circumstantial, appeared persuasive enough to convince the trial court. Ismet H. was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. For Frederik's family, the verdict represented something they desperately needed after months of grief and uncertainty. Their daughter had been brutally assaulted and murdered. Nothing could reverse that loss. Nothing could restore the future that had been taken from her. Yet the conviction appeared to offer accountability. The justice system had examined the evidence and concluded that a specific individual was responsible. In many cases, such a verdict becomes the final chapter. Families attempt to rebuild their lives. Public attention gradually fades. History records the case as solved. But the Frederik von Mollman case refused to remain simple. The defense challenged the conviction, triggering a review by higher courts. Appeals are often misunderstood by the public. They do not necessarily mean that a convicted person is innocent. Rather, They exist to ensure that convictions comply with legal standards and that verdicts are supported by sufficiently reliable evidence. In this instance, appellate judges took a closer look at the prosecution's case and identified significant concerns. The issue was not whether suspicion existed. The issue was whether the evidence eliminated reasonable doubt. Some of the evidence that appeared convincing during the original proceedings became less certain. Under closer examination, questions arose concerning the interpretation of tire track evidence. Judges scrutinized whether investigators could confidently connect the marks found near the crime, seen to a specific vehicle. Other aspects of the case were similarly challenged. The prosecution's theory remained plausible, but criminal convictions require more than plausibility. They require proof that satisfies a very high legal standard. The principle underlying this standard is one of the foundations of democratic criminal justice systems. It is better for a guilty person to go free than for an innocent person to be wrongfully convicted. Courts therefore require certainty beyond reasonable doubt before imposing punishment. If uncertainty remains, the law demands restraint. Ultimately, the higher court concluded that the evidence against Ismet H. was insufficient to support the conviction. The verdict was overturned. Even more importantly, he was acquitted. For Frederik's family, the emotional impact was devastating. They had already endured the murder of their daughter. They had sat through a criminal trial. They had listened to prosecutors argue that the evidence identified the offender. Then, after believing justice had been achieved, they watched the conviction disappear. The acquittal transformed the legal landscape of the case. Once the decision became final, a powerful legal protection came into effect. In Germany, as in many legal systems around the world, a person who has been finally acquitted cannot ordinarily be prosecuted again for the same offense. This protection is known by the Latin phrase "in bis in idem," often translated as "not twice for the same thing." In English-speaking jurisdictions, the concept is closely related to the idea of protection against double jeopardy. The principle exists for important reasons. Without such protection, individuals could face endless prosecutions until authorities eventually secure conviction. Governments could repeatedly retry defendants, subjecting them to perpetual uncertainty and punishment through process alone. Legal finality provides security. It establishes that at some point litigation must end. Yet legal principles that appear straightforward in theory often become complicated when confronted by extraordinary facts. At the time of the acquittal, few people imagined that science would one day reopen questions the courts believed had already been settled. During the years that followed, Frederik's father, Hans von Mollmann, emerged as one of the central figures in the story. While legal proceedings had concluded, his search for justice had not. He remained convinced that the truth about his daughter's murder had not been fully resolved. Decade after decade, he continued urging authorities to revisit the case. His persistence became remarkable not simply because of its duration, but because of the obstacles involved. Many families eventually reach a point where legal avenues are exhausted. The passage of time often erodes public interest. Witnesses disappear. Evidence deteriorates. Yet Hans von Mollmann refused to abandon the possibility that future developments might provide answers unavailable in the early 1980s. In retrospect, that determination would prove significant. The biological evidence collected during the original investigation had been preserved. At the time of the murder, forensic science lacked the tools needed to fully analyze such material. By the early 21st century, however, DNA technology had transformed criminal investigations around the world. Cases once considered impossible to solve suddenly yielded results. Cold cases were reopened. Innocent individuals were exonerated. Previously unknown offenders were identified. Scientific advances created opportunities that earlier generations of investigators could scarcely have imagined. In 2012, authorities re-examined biological evidence preserved from the Frederik von Mollman case. The results were dramatic. Modern DNA testing identified genetic material matching ISMAT-H, unlike the circumstantial evidence that had dominated earlier proceedings. This was direct biological evidence associated with the crime. For investigators, the significance was difficult to overstate. The technology that did not exist in 1981 now appeared capable of answering questions that had lingered for more than 3 decades. Many legal observers reached a similar conclusion. Had such evidence been available during the original proceedings, the outcome might have been very different. The DNA findings transformed public discussion of the case. Newspapers revisited the story. Legal scholars debated its implications. Ordinary citizens confronted a deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if modern science had effectively answered a question that the courts could not answer decades earlier? Yet the DNA evidence also exposed a profound conflict. Scientific truth and legal finality were no longer moving in the same direction. The evidence appeared stronger than ever. The legal barriers to prosecution remained stronger than ever as well. This conflict eventually expanded beyond the specific facts of Frederik's murder. It became a national conversation about the purpose of criminal law itself. Should a final acquittal remain untouchable regardless of future discoveries? Or should extraordinary scientific breakthroughs permit the justice system to revisit certain cases? Supporters of reopening cases argued that modern DNA evidence could reveal truths unavailable to earlier courts. If scientific certainty emerged decades later, they argued, justice demanded that the legal system respond. Opponents warned that weakening protections against repeated prosecution threatened fundamental constitutional rights. They argued that legal certainty would be undermined if acquittals could be revisited whenever new evidence appeared. Both sides claimed to be defending essential principles. One side emphasized justice for victims. The other emphasized protection against state power. Neither concern was trivial. Neither concern could be easily dismissed. Eventually, these debates reached Germany's lawmakers. In 2021, Germany adopted legal changes designed to permit the reopening of certain serious criminal cases when compelling new evidence emerged, including decisive DNA evidence. For supporters of reform, the legislation represented an attempt to address precisely the kind of situation presented by Frederik's case. The law created hope that the murder investigation might finally return to court. For the first time in decades, there appeared to be a realistic possibility that the evidence discovered through modern science would be examined in a new criminal proceeding. In February 2022, prosecutors sought to reopen the case. ISMAT-H once again faced the possibility of criminal prosecution. Nearly 40 years had passed since Frederik's murder. Entire generations had grown up during the intervening period. Yet suddenly the case seemed alive again. For Frederik's family, this development represented something they had pursued for decades. The prospect of a new trial offered the possibility that the evidence uncovered in 2012 would finally be evaluated in court. The emotional significance of that possibility cannot be overstated. Families of homicide victims often describe the passage of time as strange and uneven. Decades may pass, yet the loss remains immediate. The opportunity to seek accountability again after 40 years must have seemed almost unimaginable. Yet once more, the case entered a new legal battle. This time, the central issue was not forensic science. It was constitutional law. Defense lawyers challenged the attempt to reopen proceedings. They argued that applying the new law to a case that had already reached a final acquittal violated constitutional protections. At the heart of the dispute stood the principle of ne bis in idem. Was this protection absolute, or could it yield when powerful new evidence emerged? The question eventually reached Germany's highest constitutional authority. The significance extended far beyond a single murder case. Whatever decision emerged would influence how German law balanced competing values for years too. Kulme. On October 31st, 2023, the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany delivered its answer. The court ruled that applying the new reopening provisions to cases like Frederik's violated constitutional protections. The decision effectively blocked the renewed prosecution. Legally speaking, the acquittal remained final. The proceedings seeking to reopen the case could not continue. The consequences were immediate and profound. The anticipated retrial would not occur. The DNA evidence would not be tested in a new murder trial. Ismet H. would not face another prosecution for Frederik's murder. For supporters of constitutional protections, the ruling represented a reaffirmation of one of the most important principles in criminal law. For those seeking renewed prosecution, the decision was devastating. Once again, the legal system had reached an endpoint. Yet unlike the first acquittal, this conclusion arrived after decades of scientific advancement, public debate, legislative reform, and constitutional litigation. The case had evolved far beyond the facts of a single homicide. It had become a test of competing visions of justice itself. By the end of 2023, one reality remained unchanged. Friederike von Mühlmann was still dead. Her family still mourned her loss. DNA evidence still existed. And the legal system had determined that no new murder trial could proceed. The courtroom battle that began in the early 1980s had finally reached its conclusion. But the questions it raised were far from settled. Those questions would continue to resonate throughout Germany long after the final ruling was issued, shaping debates about law, science, victims' rights, and the meaning of justice in a world where technology can reveal answers that earlier generations never had the ability to find. When people speak about unsolved murders, they often imagine cases in which investigators never identify a suspect, evidence disappears, or crucial clues are lost forever. The murder of Frederik von Mühlmann does not fit neatly into that category, nor does it fit comfortably among cases that end with a definitive conviction. Instead, it occupies a strange and unsettling space between those two worlds. The crime itself occurred in 1981. The investigation produced a suspect. A trial resulted in a conviction. An appeal resulted in an acquittal. Decades later, advances in forensic science produced DNA evidence that investigators considered highly significant. New legislation was passed. Courts revisited the legal questions. Yet despite all of this, the case ultimately reached a destination that satisfied almost no one completely. More than 40 years after Frederik's death, the central tragedy remains unchanged. A 17-year-old girl lost her life after what should have been an ordinary journey home. Her family lost a daughter. A community lost a young member whose future had barely begun. Everything else, the investigations, the trials, the legal reforms, the constitutional debates, exist because of that fundamental fact. For Frederik's family, especially her father Hans von Mühlmann, the decades following the murder became a prolonged struggle against both time and finality. Grief itself is difficult enough. Most families affected by homicide must learn to live with the reality that no legal outcome can truly restore what has been taken from them. Yet the situation confronting the von Mühlmann family was particularly unusual. They experienced not one conclusion, but several. First came the investigation, then a conviction, then an acquittal, then the discovery of new DNA evidence, then renewed hope, then another legal defeat. Each stage reopened old wounds while simultaneously creating new expectations. Every development seemed to promise answers, only for those answers to remain contested. What made Hans von Mühlmann's efforts remarkable was not simply their duration, but their consistency. Many people would have accepted that the legal system had reached its final decision. He did not. For decades, he continued advocating for renewed examination of the evidence. He continued arguing that scientific advances should matter. He continued insisting that unanswered questions deserved attention. Regardless of where one stands on the legal issues involved, it is difficult to ignore the determination required to sustain such a campaign across multiple generations of legal and technological change. The DNA results obtained in 2012 altered the public perception of the case in profound ways. Before that point, discussions largely centered on the strengths and weaknesses of the original circumstantial evidence. After the DNA findings emerged, the debate shifted. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer primarily about tire tracks, fibers, or competing interpretations of indirect evidence. Instead, it became a discussion about what society should do when new scientific methods reveal information unavailable during an earlier trial. This question extends far beyond Frederic's case. Around the world, advances in forensic science have transformed criminal justice systems. DNA analysis has helped identify perpetrators in cold cases. It has also exonerated individuals who spent years, and sometimes decades, imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. Science has demonstrated both the power and the limitations of earlier investigative methods. As a result, legal systems have increasingly faced difficult questions about how to reconcile final judgments with newly discovered evidence. The Frederic von Mollman case became one of Germany's most significant examples of this conflict. On one side stood the desire for justice based on newly available evidence. On the other stood the principle of legal certainty. Both values are deeply embedded within democratic societies. Both serve important purposes, and both can appear equally compelling depending on one's perspective. Supporters of reopening the case argued that the pursuit of truth should not stop merely because technology arrived too late. They pointed out that investigators in 1981 lacked the forensic tools available in 2012. They argued that if modern science could provide answers, the justice system should be able to act upon them. From this perspective, denying a new trial seemed difficult to accept. Why should the timing of a scientific breakthrough determine whether evidence can be considered? Those who defended the constitutional protections surrounding acquittals emphasized a different concern. They argued that legal finality exists precisely to protect individuals from repeated prosecution. If acquittals can be reopened whenever new evidence appears, they warned, the certainty promised by the law begins to erode. The state gains expanded power to revisit old cases, potentially weakening safeguards designed to protect citizens from endless legal jeopardy. From this perspective, preserving the principle of ne bis in idem was not about a single defendant. It was about maintaining a constitutional guarantee that protects everyone. What makes the case so enduringly controversial is that neither argument is obviously unreasonable. This is not a situation in which one side advocates justice while the other opposes it. Rather, both sides appeal to important concepts of justice. One focuses on accountability and truth. The other focuses on fairness and legal restraint. The difficulty lies in determining which principle should prevail when the two come into direct conflict. The events of 2021, 2022, and 2023 illustrated just how significant that conflict had become. Germany's decision to modify the law and permit the reopening of certain murder cases based on powerful new evidence reflected a growing belief that exceptional circumstances might justify exceptional measures. For many observers, this appeared to offer a path forward. The possibility of revisiting Frederic's case seemed closer than ever before. Yet the Federal Constitutional Court ultimately reached a different conclusion. By ruling that applying the new provisions retroactively violated constitutional protections, the court reaffirmed the importance of legal finality. The decision effectively ended any realistic prospect of a new murder trial in Frederik's case. Legally speaking, the matter was settled. Emotionally and philosophically, however, the debate continues. Even today, the case is frequently discussed in legal circles, academic institutions, and media coverage examining the relationship between science and law. It is often cited as an example of how technological progress can create challenges that earlier generations of lawmakers never anticipated. The framers of legal protections against repeated prosecution could not have foreseen modern DNA analysis. Likewise, the architects of modern forensic science did not create their methods with constitutional law in mind. When those two developments eventually intersected, the result was one of the most complicated legal dilemmas in contemporary German criminal justice. The legacy of the case, therefore, extends beyond the individuals directly involved. It has influenced discussions about criminal procedure, evidentiary standards, constitutional rights, and legislative reform. It has forced lawmakers, judges, and citizens to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice itself. Is justice primarily about reaching the correct factual conclusion? Is it about preserving procedural fairness? Can both goals always be achieved simultaneously? Or are there circumstances in which society must accept that one value will inevitably limit the other? Perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate decades after Frederik's death. At its heart lies a tragedy that is easy to understand. A young woman never returned home. A family was forever changed. A life ended before adulthood had truly begun. Yet surrounding that tragedy is a legal puzzle that resists simple solutions. The case also serves as a reminder of the limitations of every justice system. Courts strive to discover the truth, but they do so within rules. Those rules exist for reasons. They protect rights, establish standards, and create predictability. Yet rules can also produce outcomes that feel unsatisfactory when viewed through the lens of hindsight. Scientific advances may reveal information that earlier courts never had access to. New evidence may emerge after legal deadlines have passed. Technology may answer questions long after the opportunity for prosecution has disappeared. The law cannot always adapt without creating new problems of its own. In the end, the murder of Frederik von Mollman remains one of the most debated cases in modern German history precisely because it lacks a universally accepted conclusion. There is a victim whose death is undisputed. There is a suspect whose connection to evidence became a matter of intense public discussion decades later. There are court decisions that remain legally binding. There are scientific findings that continue to provoke debate. And there is a family whose search for justice became part of the nation's legal history. More than 4 decades have passed since the evening of November 4th, 1981. The buses that once traveled between Celle and Oldau have changed. The world has changed. Technology has advanced beyond anything investigators could have imagined at the time. Entire generations have grown up knowing the case only through books, documentaries, legal analyses, and news reports. Yet when the layers of legal complexity are stripped away, the story returns to a single moment. A 17-year-old girl leaves choir practice. She expects to go home. She never arrives. Everything that followed, the investigation, the trials, the appeals, the DNA testing, the legislative reforms, the constitutional rulings, grew from that one irreversible event. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the Frederik von Mollman case. Criminal justice systems can debate principles. Scientists can develop new methods. Legislators can amend laws. Courts can issue rulings. But none of those actions can change the original loss at the center of the story. For Frederik's family, the passage of time never erased that loss. For Germany, the case became a lasting reminder that justice is not always a destination. Sometimes it is a question, one that survives long after the courtrooms have emptied, long after the headlines have faded, and long after the law has delivered its final word. And in the case of Frederike von Mollman, that question continues to echo more than 40 years after a young girl set out for home and vanished into one of the most controversial chapters of German criminal history. Long after the investigations ended, long after the appeals had been exhausted, and long after the final constitutional ruling closed the last remaining legal path, the name Frederike von Mollman continued to echo throughout Germany. Most murder cases eventually settle into history. They become court records, archived newspaper articles, or forgotten files stored in government buildings. The case of Frederike was different. It refused to disappear because it evolved into something larger than the crime itself. It became a symbol of the strengths of modern science, a symbol of the limitations of criminal law, and, perhaps most importantly, a symbol of the painful reality that truth and justice do not always arrive at the same moment. When people discuss famous criminal cases, there's often an assumption that the most important question is whether investigators identified the offender. In many cases, that is indeed the central issue. Families desperately seek answers. Police pursue suspects. Prosecutors attempt to prove guilt. Yet the Frederike von Mollman case demonstrated that identifying a suspect is not necessarily the end of the story, even when evidence appears to point strongly in one direction. Legal systems must still operate according to rules that extend beyond any individual case. This reality created a paradox that many observers found difficult to accept. By the early 1980s, investigators believed they had identified the man responsible for Frederike's rape and murder. The courts ultimately determined that the available evidence was insufficient. The suspect was acquitted. Decades later, DNA technology emerged as one of the most powerful forensic tools ever developed. Evidence preserved from 1981 was re-examined. The results appeared to connect the same suspect to biological evidence associated with the crime. Yet, because the acquittal had already become final decades earlier, the legal system faced a barrier that scientific progress could not easily overcome. The result was one of the most unusual situations in modern criminal justice. A case in which advances in forensic science generated new certainty while constitutional law reinforced old finality. For many members of the public, this outcome felt deeply unsatisfying. People naturally expect legal systems to pursue factual truth wherever it leads. When scientific evidence appears to answer a question that once seemed impossible to resolve, there is a strong instinct to believe that courts should act upon that information. The emotional logic is understandable. If better evidence exists, why should it not be used? Yet constitutional democracies are built not only on outcomes, but also on principles. The protection against repeated prosecution did not emerge by accident. It developed over centuries as a safeguard against governmental abuse. Without such protections, individuals could theoretically face endless legal attacks until authorities eventually secure conviction. The burden of repeated prosecutions can itself become a punishment. The challenge presented by Frederike's case was that both perspectives possessed legitimate moral weight. One side asked whether a murder victim deserved justice when powerful new evidence emerged. The other asked whether constitutional guarantees remain meaningful if they can be suspended. Whenever a particularly difficult case appears, the legal system ultimately chose the second principle. But the debate itself never disappeared. Law schools across Germany examined the case. Legal scholars published analyses. Constitutional experts debated the implications. Victims, rights advocates, and criminal defense lawyers often reached very different conclusions regarding what the correct outcome should have been. The case became a textbook example of competing legal values colliding head-on. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the story is how much of its later significance can be traced back to decisions made in 1981, when investigators collected biological evidence from the crime scene and from the victim. They could not possibly have known how valuable those samples would become. DNA profiling, as we know it today, did not yet exist. The officers preserving evidence were simply following investigative procedures, gathering every potentially relevant item they could find. Decades later, those preserved samples became the foundation for a national legal controversy. The evidence survived. The science advanced. The law struggled to determine how to respond. Cases like Fredericks reveal an uncomfortable truth about criminal investigations. Justice often depends upon timing. A crime committed 10 years later might be solved differently because better technology exists. A trial held 20 years later might include evidence unavailable to earlier courts. A suspect prosecuted in one era may benefit from scientific limitations that disappear in another. This is not a flaw unique to Germany. It is a reality faced by legal systems around the world. Courts can only evaluate evidence that exists at the time proceedings occur. They cannot anticipate future discoveries. The Fredericks case, therefore, became part of a broader, global conversation about the relationship between law and technology. Scientific progress moves forward relentlessly. Legal systems move more cautiously. Technology asks what can now be known. The law asks what should now be done. Those questions are not always compatible. For Hans von Mollmann, however, the case was never primarily about legal theory. It was about his daughter. Behind every constitutional debate stood a family that had suffered an irreversible loss. Behind every court filing stood memories of a 17-year-old girl who had once sung in a church choir, traveled between Celle and Oldau, and expected to return home after rehearsal. The extraordinary legal journey that followed should never obscure that central reality. Too often, famous criminal cases become dominated by discussions of suspects, investigators, judges, and legal procedures. The victim gradually fades into the background. The story of Fredericks von Mollmann reminds us why that should never happen. She was not merely a name attached to a court case. She was a teenager with a future, a daughter, a friend, a member of her community. A young woman whose life ended before adulthood had truly begun. Everything that followed, the investigations, the trials, the appeals, the DNA testing, the constitutional challenges, the legislative reforms, occurred because her life was violently taken away. The legal significance of the case remains enormous. Indeed, few criminal cases have influenced German legal discussions as profoundly. The public pressure generated by the case contributed to legislative efforts aimed at permitting retrials when powerful new evidence emerges. The constitutional challenges that followed forced Germany's highest court to clarify the boundaries of legal finality. Even though the attempt to reopen the case ultimately failed, the broader discussion reshaped public understanding of criminal justice. In that sense, Fredericks' case changed the legal landscape even without producing a new conviction. Future generations of lawyers, judges, legislators, and scholars will likely continue studying the case because it captures a dilemma that has no easy solution. How should societies balance truth and finality? How should constitutional protections adapt to scientific breakthroughs? Can a legal system remain both fair and flexible? And what should happen when those goals come into conflict? These questions existed before Fredericks' murder. They will continue to exist long after everyone directly involved in the case is gone. Perhaps that is why the story remains so haunting. Not because every mystery was solved, not because every legal dispute reached a universally accepted conclusion, but because the case forces us to confront the limits of certainty itself. Science can provide answers. Courts can provide rulings. Neither can erase the past. On the evening of November 4th, 1981, Frederik von Mollman left choir practice expecting to complete a short journey home. That journey never ended. More than 4 decades later, Germany still remembers her. Not only because of the brutality of the crime that took her life, but because of the extraordinary legal battle that followed. Her case became a crossroads where grief, science, law, and morality all met. And standing at that crossroads is a question that remains unresolved in the minds of many people. When new evidence reveals what may have happened, but the law says the matter is already settled, has justice been served, or has justice arrived too late? The answer depends on whom you ask. But the importance of the question ensures that Frederik von Mollman's story will continue to be remembered, discussed, and studied for generations to come.